your deck probably has a hole in it, and that hole can drain all of the fun from your Commander games. Now, it's obviously not a physical hole, but that fact does make it that much harder to spot. I've built and reviewed hundreds of decks, and I've seen this problem over and over, and I'm here to help you make sure that you don't hit potholes in your own game plan. But first, I should demystify this metaphorical hole. The hole represents the things missing from your deck that create dead turns. You know, turns where you do absolutely nothing, or you do something that you just kind of know won't have any impact. And these dead turns feel horrible. It's a bit like the SpongeBob meme and We're Squidward, looking out of the window as everyone else is out having a great time. Whilst these turns often feel like bad luck, or perhaps because we drew badly, the sad reality is that the vast majority of times, it's not bad luck or bad draws, it is instead self-inflicted because these dead turns are built into your deck without you even realizing it. So in this video, I'm going to illuminate where these holes hide within your decks, so that you can find and fix it. And of course, I'm going to save the trickiest and most impactful ones nearer to the end. Now, to have an enjoyable game of Commander, it helps if you have a good attitude and entertaining friends. But probably the most impactful thing that affects whether or not you have a good time actually playing your deck is taking a lot of game actions. A game action just means doing something in the game, like playing a creature or spell, and it's the natural antidote to those SpongeBob window turns. When deck building, it's really easy to get lured in by plenty of big, expensive, and powerful cards. The downside of this is you're often stuck with a bunch of them in your hand and you can't cast them till the late game, and that's a whole bunch of dead turns. Then when you get there, you can maybe cast one per turn. If your spell resolves in the way you hope it will, that can feel rewarding at that point, but when you're investing all those resources into a big play, that play is often threatening. So your opponents really are incentivized to stop you, in which they often will for 1 to 2 mana, and now you're down a lot of resources and you've achieved almost nothing, and that feels horrible. So instead, you want your deck to facilitate taking many game actions in a turn cycle, and especially proactive ones that don't solely rely on interacting with what other players are doing. This is an overarching idea that's going to bleed into almost every other point in the video, but as a starting point, the core question to ask of your deck is this: do you have the right combination of spells at different mana costs to let you do something impactful on every turn of the game? Now, that last phrase is really important, because not all game actions are created equal. Whilst doing nothing sucks, doing tons of things and achieving nothing is equally as bad. So what you really want to do is to maximize impactful game actions. Basically, you want to be doing things that meaningfully progress the game forward or have a big impact on the game. What counts as impactful is obviously going to be a little bit subjective, but as a few quick examples, playing a simple 2/2 creature will likely have no impact on the game overall, regardless of what turn you cast it on. But playing a Doughty Voidwalker, a Badger Mole-Cub, or perhaps an Orcish Bowmasters can have a massive impact on the game, despite their similar casting cost and stat profile. This is obviously an extreme comparison, but when you're thinking of cards to add to your decks, think about their potential impact on the overall game. If we instead look at non-creature spells, playing a removal spell like a Swords to Plowshares to remove a game-ending threat, or a counterspell in either offense or defense can likewise have an equally large impact, often completely flipping the tempo or the outcome of a game. If you compare the potential impact of spells like these, they will be higher than almost anything else you have access to in Commander, which is why they're so prevalent as staples. But how do we measure the impact? Well, I'll tell you in just a second, but first, there's something incredible I have to tell you about, and that's the new McDonald's drop by Voidmonster. If you like highly unique Magic accessories, then you're in for an absolute treat with this one. Voidmonster is a TCG-inspired accessories and apparel brand by Magic artist Forrest Demel. You know, the guy that did your favorite band Goblin Pirate. Voidmonster does a new drop every month, and this month, we're visiting McDonald's. The drop includes a playmat and an incredible deck box, and honestly my favorite part, like many of Voidmonster's deck boxes, is the art on the inside. The vibes are absolutely impeccable. If this looks like your vibe, then orders are open for a week and are live now, with pre-orders ending on August 30th at 12 PM PST, so get them before they're gone. There's a link in the description in the pinned comment that you can use to find them, and thank you to Voidmonster for making absolutely sick gear and for sponsoring this video. Coming back to measuring the impact in a game of Commander, the core goal of the game is ultimately to reduce your opponent's life totals down to 0. So think about how much of an impact every card in your deck can have on your opponent's life totals, or alternatively, how much it can stop your opponents from impacting yours. Going back to the humble counterspell, it could stop something like a Chandra's Ignition from doing a total of 60, 40, or even 100 or more damage across the different players in the game. That's a very direct exchange of stopping damage. But what if, in like Douthie Voidwalker's case, it's instead stopping cards from going to the graveyard? Well, that can shut down all manner of decks who would turn those cards in the graveyard into damage, value, or synergy, all of which will definitely have an impact on your life total later on. Douthie Voidwalker is thus indirectly doing probably as much of a preventative job as the counterspell, just in a less obvious way. The important thing here is for you to fill your deck with high impact cards. If you do, you're going to be much less likely to have dead turns because even playing one spell per turn cycle will at the very least make an impact if it's something like a Douthie Voidwalker or a counterspell. It's for this very reason that my Sheldon You Did This to Yourself deck is so much fun to play. It's an Aikido style deck, meaning you use your opponent's stuff against them, but almost every card in the deck has the potential to be highly impactful, even if the actual cards don't actually have that much synergy with each other. So synergy basically just means that your cards are working together so that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Let's look at an example from my Sauron the Dark Lord deck. Sauron lets me amass 1 whenever an opponent casts a spell, but if I pair him with Malha Uruk-hai Captain, now I amass 2 every time someone plays a spell instead. And because my win condition is blowing up an orc army with something like Chandra's Ignition, Malha literally halves the time it takes for me to build a lethal threat, which really isn't bad for 2 mana. Another of Sauron's abilities is that whenever the ring tempts me, like on the card Call of the Ring, or perhaps when my orc army deals combat damage, I can discard my hand and draw 4 cards. That is already an amazing card draw engine, because every turn I can discard my hand, draw 4, play them, and then do it again the next turn. But what if a bunch of the cards that I'm discarding have flashback, like Mystic Retrieval or Deep Analysis? Well, now I'm getting even more value because I can cast those spells from my graveyard. These cards come together to build an experience where everything just works together. Synergy in your deck will look different depending on what kind of deck it is and depending on your game plan. Synergy in my Galadeth Prismari deck is focused around as many of cards as possible being artifacts or creating artifact tokens so that I can have an incredibly large amount of mana to use to cast game-ending spells. Synergy in my Lys Hex deck is that almost all of my cards cost 2 mana, reduced down to 1, which synergizes incredibly well with Lys's prowess. And the vast majority also draw me cards, creating an incredibly explosive and resilient Voltron threat. If I look at something like my Meren deck, it just means that most of my deck, if not all of it, is creatures. Critically here, think of your deck a little bit like a river with different streams flowing into it. Each way that your cards synergize together is like adding another stream to the river, and the more streams that you have feeding the river, the bigger and more powerful it becomes. The more synergy you have, the more your cards will work together like this, and the more enjoyable your deck will be to play. In addition to just being fun and enjoyable, it's also going to mean that you'll end up winning much more if you care about that. Speaking of winning, in Commander and in life, it's definitely possible to have too much of a good thing. Even a 10 out of 10 banger of a Commander game rapidly stops being fun if it goes on for too long. And that's if it's the best game you've ever played. If the average game of Commander drags on too long, it just ends up sucking, which is why you want strong win conditions or ways to end the game. Going back to my Sauron example, if my whole plan was just to build a big orc army, people could simply block it. If someone had an abundance of small creatures like tokens, we could literally be there all night. Which is why my deck runs cards like Chandra's Ignition or Soulsfire. Going back to the idea of your deck being like a river, your win conditions are how you force all those different streams to come together into one powerful overflowing rapids that ends the game. Every deck's version of this will look a little bit different. If you've got an elf deck with tons of elves, your win condition might be an overrun or a Crater Hoof Behemoth style effect, so you can make them all big, give them trample, and win the game. I have a whole video about how many different types of cards you might want in your deck, which I'll link in the pinned comment. Typically, to get one of a card by about turn 7 or 8, you probably want to have 6 or more of them in your deck, which is a good rough idea of how many individual win condition cards you need. That said, if you add too many, you can find yourself in a spot where your hand is full of win conditions, but you have no streams to focus into a river, and you get left high and dry. Now, making sure you have the right amount of win conditions plays into my next point, which is making sure you have a plan for every stage of the game. When I say stage of the game, I mean early, mid, and late. Exactly which turns this refers to is kind of dependent on the bracket or power level you're playing at, but as an example, in bracket 3, the early game is turns 1 and 2, mid games is like turn 3 to 5, and late game is turn 6 and beyond. I often see decks that are quite lopsided and are completely lacking in plays for certain parts of the game, that could be doing nothing in the first 2 turns, or perhaps doing tons of things in those first 2 or 3 turns, but having very few impactful plays when we have a lot of mana after turn 6. In Magic terminology, this is typically referred to as the mana curve, and it means that you have the cards to play throughout the game based on how much mana you're going to have available. If we cast our minds back to the conversation about game actions, it helps you realize why it's so important to plan out your deck that it can give you reliable plays on each turn and in each part of the game. Again, as before, each deck is a little bit different. If you're playing, say, a Goblin deck, you may not end up having a lot of high cost cards that you play after turn 6. Instead, you may have or cast multiple impactful 2 and 3 drop cards instead. A card like the Great Goblin will be as scary regardless of when it hits the table. Or perhaps you're playing a deck that wants ramp and you have a lot of 2 mana ramp spells that you aim to play on turn 2. Well, then maybe you don't really care about 3 drops in your deck at all, and perhaps you skip that entirely and go straight from 2 to 4 mana in your mana curve. I have many decks like this, like my Aragorn Spellslinger or Ian Malcolm Dinosaurs deck. The core takeaway here is you should be thinking about the plays you're going to make each turn of the game, and have enough of each mana value of card to make sure that you have an impactful play on each turn. Don't leave that to chance, because you can ensure, at least for the most part, that it happens. Now, I can't mention ramp without talking about mana, because if there's one surefire way to hand yourself dead turns, it's to build a mana base that doesn't actually serve your deck. I've got a whole video about this topic that you can go and watch, which again, I will link down below the like button, which if you haven't already, you should really be clicking. But likes aside, there are some important fundamentals here, starting with simply running enough lands. How many? Well, that depends a little bit, but a safe place to be is about 38 to 40. Certain very ramp-heavy decks, like Elf decks or CDH decks, can go lower, down to perhaps the low 30s, but for 95% of the decks that exist, you're going to want to have about 38 lands. Now, not every deck wants ramp, but if yours does, you're aiming for a total of around 50 mana sources in the deck. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, because it's half the damn deck, but based on the math, it really isn't. 38 lands means you should hit your land drops through to about turn 4 at least, and 12 pieces of ramp means you're reliably going to find one by turn 2, and in almost every deck that wants ramp, you want both of those things to be true. Beyond the fundamentals, the same way you think about how ramp shapes your mana curve, you need to make sure you're running enough sources of each color that you actually need, and that you don't have too many tapped lands. Tapped lands are often the easiest and cheapest way to fix your colors, but they can completely ruin the flow of your deck. On turn 1, they're usually fine because you probably weren't going to be doing much anyway. But if you play another tap land on turn 2, now you've got 1 mana available and you can't cast your ramp source. So instead of powering out your 4-cast commander, say something like an Ishtola, on turn 3, she's now coming down on turn 4 regardless, and the ramp will be stuck in your hand. Sure, you could play that rock on turn 3 instead, but it's going to feel clunky as hell. In general, you probably don't want more than an absolute maximum of 9 tapped lands in your deck, because that way roughly one of the first 4 lands will be tapped and you can hopefully get it out of the way on turn 1. But, and this is an important but, you'll still be playing tapped lands later in the game. And there, the cost can be even bigger, because that huge spell that would win you the game could now be sitting in your hand because you're 1 mana short and the tapped land that you just drew can't help you. There's much more room for this at lower powers, where the pace of the game is slower, but if you're playing at bracket 3 or above, that one single mana can mean the difference between winning or losing, but also just between feeling like you got to participate or not. So realistically, you want a small handful at most. But most importantly, keep an eye on whether your lands and your mana generation are propelling the deck forward rather than holding it back. By this point, you hopefully know that more game actions equals more fun. And if you're game action maxing, one thing you absolutely cannot do is to run out of cards. Honestly, if you want one single thing you can do to improve your commander deck, is to make sure that you have a good card advantage engine and more than enough card draw in your deck. How much card draw is enough? Well, you can almost not have too much of it, but I would say that around 12 or more sources is a good place to start. Card draw comes in many forms, like once-off card draw spells that simply draw you a bunch of cards, like a Pirate's Pillage or a Stock Up. Then there's impulse draw, like Ren's Resolve or Jeska's Will, which exiles cards that can be cast this or the next turn. Or there are incremental card draw engines, like Mentor of the Meek, Beast Whisperer, or Whirlwind of Thought. But be very careful with this last category, because whilst they can often be the most powerful with the highest ceiling, their floor is also the lowest. Having almost no cards in hand and drawing one of these, or playing one of them and having it die to removal immediately, doesn't instantly give you a bunch more options like the Stock Up or Pirate's Pillage would. It's also worth calling out that there are certain cards or commanders that create card advantage systems, like my favorite Mirren, who effectively draws you a card each turn if you've got a creature in your graveyard. Or if you're a Spellslinger enjoyer, there are commanders like Emmet Selk or Kess who get stuff in our graveyard flashback. Coming back to the river metaphor, the cards in your hand are the river, and if you run out of cards, the river dries up. Now we're getting close to solving all the causes of dead turns here, but we have to talk about interaction. Because if your deck isn't equipped to do things on other people's turns, you're literally cutting yourself out of 75% of the game. Note that I said interaction and specifically did not say removal, partially because that includes board wipes, and honestly from my perspective, sorcery speed board wipes just suck in Commander, unless they're one-sided wipes that leave you in a strong position to win the game. If all you're doing is just hitting a big reset button, you may as well restart the game entirely. Interaction, on the other hand, absolutely slaps. Because a well-timed instant speed spell, like a Negate, a Swords to Plowshares, or even the humble Fog, creates the highest highs that you can get in a Commander game. Stories of the best Commander games very rarely start with, remember that time someone jorked their deck until they won? The remember the time stories happen because someone cast a deflecting palm on an infinite damage burn spell and hit the caster with a massive Uno reverse. Or because I pumped half my life into hatred, giving my opponent's tiny unblocked commander lethal commander damage against the player who was wildly ahead. The thing about interaction is that nobody sees it coming, and it creates these kind of swing moments that we spend all of our time chasing in this board game version of Magic. Now, everything I just mentioned is in the direction of disruption, but there's a second equally important half of that interaction which is focused around protection. Our opponents are going to do their best to mess with our stuff at the least opportune moment. So we're going to want instant speed answers of our own. Negate or Counterspell do double duty here, because Counter Magic is a great way to protect your key pieces. Beyond counterspells, there are cards that grant protection, indestructible, hexproof, or cards that flicker your stuff, and these are all excellent ways to say no thank you when someone tries to remove your toys. Whilst protecting our stuff is important, don't forget that you can point these spells at another player's things too, protecting someone else's board to create some top-tier politics. Either way, having enough interaction gives you agency to play the entire game and not just the portion of it, and quite often the plays these cards will create will be the moments that you remember. Now, this is definitely a video aimed at newer players, but because of the nature of Commander and the way it's casual, people dip in and out, I have many friends who have played for years and still make these mistakes when they're brewing up a new Commander deck, so there's a good chance that you may be too. This is not a prescriptive checklist that you have to go through one by one and tick off when you build the new deck. That said, if you've got a deck that isn't working quite like you want it to, or you're building a new deck and something just seems a little bit off, then asking these questions of your deck will probably help you find the answers to where things are going wrong. If you can think of any other areas or situations that lead to dead turns, yap at me in the comments. If you haven't subscribed, go and do that so that you get my next video that's going to be all about my process of building a Commander deck from start to finish. If you want to support what I do, head over to my Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone over there that helps me keep the lights on, especially the Gigafroges. And if you want personal tailored help with your deck, I offer that over on Coffee, and the links to that are all down below the like button. Last, but definitely not least, if you enjoyed this, here are 2 videos that you may want to go and watch if you've not seen them already. And as always, thank you for being here.